This program is brought to you by cable franchise fees and generous donations from viewers like you.
Right at 9 o'clock or a couple minutes after, and I'm going to call the Finance Committee meeting of April 12th, 2022 to order. And we have a quorum of the Finance Committee here. We also have a quorum of the council. So when I finish calling going through the process of starting the meeting for the Finance Committee, I will then turn it over to the council president because she's going to want to convene a meeting of the council itself also as soon as I can conclude. So in any event, pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, extended by Chapter 22 of the Acts of 2022, this meeting will be conducted via remote means. Members of the public who wish to access the meeting may do so via Zoom and by telephone. No in-person attendance of members of the public will be permitted. This is a meeting that is being convened solely as a virtual meeting, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access proceedings in real time via technological means. And we will have public comment, but the public comment will be late in the meeting, not early in the meeting. And I am now going to ask the members of the Finance Committee to indicate their presence and that they can hear, and so we can confirm that they hear us. And I'll start with Lynn Griesmer.
Present.
Bob Hegner.
Present.
Matt Holloway.
Present.
Bernie Kubiak.
Present.
Michelle Miller.
Here.
Kathy Shane. Kathy. You're muted, so I can't hear you.
Here.
Okay, thank you. And I'm here, and I don't believe I've seen Alicia Walker. So, but we do have a quorum with all members, but one currently present. Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you about convening a meeting of the council.
Seeing that we have a quorum of the council present, I'm going to call the council meeting to order, for the Finance Committee as a joint meeting with the Finance Committee. And I want to make sure that those councilors who are present can hear us and we can hear them. So I'm going to start with Anna Devlin Gothier.
Here, sorry I'm late.
No problem. Pat DeAngelis.
Present.
Jennifer Taub.
Present.
Mandy Johanneke.
Present.
I believe that's everyone. Thank you.
Okay, so our normal process for Finance Committee meetings is we review the agenda as the next item. And so what I'm going to just say is there are essentially three items in addition to public comment that are on the agenda. The way it's listed, item 2 is going to actually be at the end of the meeting. It was added as the last minute item, but is really Finance Committee oriented. And we have people who are joining us for other agenda items first. So that's going to be the last item. And we are going to start with the what's listed as item 3, the FY23 budget review for the regional school district. It says budget and capital. We will be looking at the operating budget first and then the capital budget of the regional schools. which is a separate request, but is an important part of the budget. Then the water and sewer regulations, we have two people from the Department of Public Works, but we have asked that they not join us at the beginning of the meeting unless they want to, because we know we're going to start with schools. So unless there's objection from the committee, we will handle that, and we'll fit the minutes approval in later in the meeting. So turning then to the schools, I want to welcome Superintendent Morris and Dr. Slaughter, the finance director of the schools. And they made a presentation at the most recent council meeting, so that we have the background information already presented. I don't know if there are any additional things that either of you would like to say to the committee, sort of to launch the discussion, or if we want to go to questions. So, Dr. Morris.
Thank you very much, Andy. So just briefly, just to recap, I think some of the important pieces of that conversation. One is that the district developed a sort of compromise to satisfy the concerns and requests that we received from our 4-member towns. This is the first member town where we're having more active discussion. The other 3 towns, I think just for context, it's important for folks to know, have town meetings, one at the end of this month, and then the other 2 towns are in mid-May. So from a process perspective, we need approval of all 4 towns of both the assessment method as well as the financial dollar amount to move forward with the budget for the region for the next school year. So we appreciate the council taking us early. We know this is sort of off schedule for when you're considering the budget, but doing that allows you to weigh in before the other 3 towns perhaps have already voted, and I think it's a much more healthy process. So I really appreciate the council and the FinCom allowing us to come early. And so the compromise piece was really around getting to a more durable, sustainable assessment method. And so what you saw in the presentation last week, or have seen in the past, if you're following some of the regional school committee meetings, is moving to a 100% statutory method with a smoothing measure that has a 5-year smoothing measure rolled into it. And we're able to do that in part and make this transition because we do have ESSER funds, which are funds from the Stimulus Act that support our regional schools, that helps bridge the gap for us. We are moving to a place where a year from now in the next budget, we will have 6th graders from the Amherst elementary schools attending the regional middle school. There would have to be a financial arrangement sorted out about the rental of space, and perhaps portions of staff members like nurses, custodians, folks who wouldn't come with their own staff for 140, 150 kids. And so that is another part of this whole equation long term about making things more sustainable. So we've so far we've had a relatively, for us, a low drama budget year as it relates to regional schools. It's a low bar perhaps because we often have struggles between our 4 towns about both the assessment method and the dollar amount, as well as our community about the services we provide. So we're hoping to continue that, but we'll see how that plays out. We're open, of course, to any questions that any members have today. I think the council emailed us a question about an hour ago that probably we weren't able to compile all the information. So please know this isn't the last opportunity to ask questions. If you do have questions, we may not have all the answers if it takes some background research to be able to do it, but we commit to getting back to you to the best of our ability in a timely manner. With that, I'll turn it back to the Finance Committee and the Council.
Thank you. So just to remind everybody of the process that we've established, and then I'll get to people who've raised hands because we're focusing on process right now before we get to substance. The charter does have a provision that if there is reason to take a section of the budget separately, that we have the capacity to do so. That was written into the charter because I was, as a select board member, consulting with the Charter Commission about the finance sections, partly with the regional schools in mind, because we recognize that this is going to be a challenge, and this is the best way to handle it. There is a requirement in the charter that there be a budget hearing for all parts of the budget, and and if we take something out of order, the charter does require that we have a budget hearing for that piece before we actually can vote on it. So the plan is that there will be a budget hearing at the council meeting on April 25th. April 26th, there'll be a finance committee meeting to talk about and make a final recommendation on the regional school budget and forward it. We do that after the public hearing, because we want to be able to consider any public comments. And then the plan is that at the May 2 council meeting that we would be able to take a vote. And as will be explained later, that's actually a significant date because of the capital part of the budget, which is the second part of the discussion on regional schools today. So I don't know if Lynn has anything else to add to that. And if not, Sean, you had your hand up a minute ago.
I have nothing, Andy. That was an excellent overview. Thanks. But
yeah, you covered everything that I was going to say.
Yeah, I want to make sure, though, that if particularly new counselors are, counselors that have returned, if you have questions about the process, we should talk about that now.
Okay, seeing no questions about process, then I guess we should go ahead. Kathy, do you have something on process, or you want to go?
I have a process. I think it's a process timeline, not for what today, but the regional school capital budget. Don't we have to consider that with a up or down earlier than the capital budget we're looking at in June? Don't we have a once it's submitted to us earlier? I'm just looking at the timeline on that. That was my question.
Okay. The answer is basically yes, because of the provisions of how the budget process for capital works. And that's why May 2 is a key date. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that. Sean?
Yeah, so, and I'm sure Doug was going to say this, you have 60 days. The council has 60 days to act upon the vote of the regional school committee, which was on March 15th, right, Doug? So that's why we have the vote on both the operating budget and the capital for the region on May 2nd. So that's within that 60-day window.
And can I just follow up? When we're voting, are we voting only on FY23, or are we also voting on the possible plan with track in all its glory meaning more than one version of it?
I would defer to Doug to explain the capital vote.
Okay, I mean, maybe we're getting into substance now, so I can wait on that. Like, I got the first one. Thanks.
Okay, Doug?
So what I'll say is this, is that, so there's sort of two parts to capital. There's the capital assessment, which is the part of the budget. That can be a part of the budget. It doesn't have the 60-day limit quite the same way the debt authorization does. So the debt authorization is the one that has the 60-day window in which the council would have to take action to either agree with that or disagree with that. The actual assessment is just a single year assessment, just like the operating budget's a single year operating budget. Those two are pieces of the overall budget. And then the third piece to the overall budget is the assessment method. The debt authorization is a somewhat separate but integrated step that you would take as well. And it is just an authorization for an amount to be borrowed. And there's two pieces to it. One sort of regular looking capital items, and then one larger project, which has some variability to how it may play out.
Okay, anything else on process? Because otherwise I'm going to turn to the regional budget, the operating budget. Lynn?
I just want to acknowledge that it is an unusual capital budget. And when we get to it, we should spend some time on just that piece of it. Okay.
So what I'm going to do is recognize anybody who's either a member of the Finance Committee or a counselor and not a member of the Finance Committee, just in order of people asking to be recognized with questions about the budget. And so at this point, if you have questions that you would like to ask about the regional budget, please raise your hand, and I will be doing my best to recognize people in the order in which they ask for recognition, and we'll proceed from there. And I'm going to also ask that if you have a series of questions that you handle you just recognize that there may be a number of people who are asking for recognition. And I don't know who suggested the question to Lynn that was posed in advance, but not everybody may be aware of what that question is. So I don't know, Lynn, if
It was a question that came from Counselor Shane, and it was to ask for multiple years of comparison of number of students, number of faculty, and budget. And for the most recent 5 years, and then in increments of 5 years, going back up to 20 years.
And I'll just say, I didn't expect to get those for today, but I think it would be just useful for us to be able to see that kind of trend. And so far we've been provided parts of it. So it's not that we have nothing. So thank you.
I also want to ask Dorothy, if you can hear us. And
Yes, I can hear you.
okay, thank you.
okay, so then I'll look for people to raise hands. And Kathy, your hand is up. So
Okay, so we're focusing first just on operating budget, correct?
correct. And right now I see 3 hands, so I'm taking it in order that they went up. Kathy?
Okay, so I may be mixing the discussion a little bit, but as I understand it, you've been able to achieve the projected operating budget, which has an increase of 3.9% for Amherst compared to the guideline that we put out of 2.5%, because you've got ESSER funds. And so you're able to do the current budget without any significant changes in staffing. So I'm wondering what happens in 24, 25. What do we, if we look out a little bit, what happens when there's no ESSER? That's question number 1. So I'll just do my second one because it's linked to this. The 6th grade is scheduled to move up in the fall of 23, which is the next FY year. It's FY 24. Does that help? It's related to my question about FY 24. The town will be paying rent to the regional school. And I'm wondering if it also helps that there are more students. So the cost per student might be down because you can spread art and music and language. You potentially got 6th grade with some of those extras. So I'm looking for, if we're okay for this year, tight but okay, what happens a year from now? And I'll stop. Those are my 2 questions.
Doug, do you want to start us off? I can jump in.
Yeah, I will. I can start us off. So I'll start with the second one first, I think, in some respects. So talking about the sixth grade moving to the middle school, there is some economy that will be gained potentially with staffing in some respects. There may be some loss of that in the elementary schools because for example, let's take a nurse. You have to have a nurse in the building, so that cost per student at say Wildwood will be a little higher because you'll have the sixth grade out, but you'll still need a full-time nurse there. On the other hand, we'll share a nurse at the middle school, and so that'll reduce the cost. Some of those things will kind of offset each other. But there are other economies that won't have an expense on sort of the other side of the equation from the two districts, that sort of thing. So yes, we have ESSER funds the current year and next year. We'll probably leverage those in both years to sort of smooth the transition as we wait until sixth grade comes online in the middle school. That will provide some relief to the regional budget for sure. I think it also will to the Amherst budget. So we're using those ESSER funds to help kind of bridge that gap of time. But it won't be easy. And I think that there are going to be some hard choices we're going to make over the next couple of years as we look at the staffing levels we have, the number of students we have, the costs we have, and the available funds. And so ESSER will definitely help us out through the next couple of years. And one of the things we'll need to do as we plan for those sixth graders in the middle school is to try to find as many economies we can to help smooth out that transition in cost and that loss of resource from the ESSER funds.
I could add just very briefly, ESSER funds, we are working hard not to expend all of them quickly. And so we don't know what shape the virus will take. Obviously, we're at a period of higher concern than we were a month ago at the moment. And I'd love to be right in predicting the future of COVID, but if I could do that, I'd take that on the road and probably our budget problems would be solved. So I don't want to go there, but it is the case that we do have to be aware that we may have other mitigations that occur in the future, but we do have the funds for one more or part of one more fiscal year. So we are looking ahead and preserving some amount of funds for budget support for the FY24 budget. And at that point, unless the federal authorities relax their deadline, which I believe they are not slated to do, despite a lot of urging professional organizations like my national one, I think that's where the cliff that we talk about will be. So we do anticipate being able to use some ESSER funds for budget support for the FY24 budget, but FY25 as it currently stands, that's where that budget support will end.
Andy, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Is there anything else you have, Kathy? Otherwise, I'm going to go into Bob.
No, my other question's a different issue. So go to Bob and then Mandy. You go to the others.
Okay, Bob.
Yeah, I wanted to focus a little bit on the revenue. I'm looking at the table on page 20 of the report, and I noticed that the transportation reimbursement went up by 100,000, and the E&D for budget support went up 700,000, went up 500,000. Are these new levels the kind of thing that is going to continue into 24 and 25, or are they one-time increases that could be reduced in the future? Because they obviously would impact the budget tremendously. That's it.
So I can answer that, and I'll start with the transportation reimbursement. The recent history of transportation reimbursement has been a little stronger than it has been in previous years, and so they've been able to support us at a little bit higher level. So that's hopeful that it will stay at that level of support. Some of it's a reimbursement for costs that we incur, so our costs are going up as well. So it's a little bit of a wash in some respects. Hopefully we can have and continue to have a fairly decent contract with our bus company and our own internal systems of providing transportation. So that's likely to stay fairly steady in and around that level of support. For E&D, it's of higher use this year. We finished last year with a significant amount of surplus, quite frankly, and so our E&D was much higher. We had a lot of unknowns as we went through last year, and as a result, we were holding off on spending in order to sort of anticipate and be ready for any kind of an extraordinary cost, which didn't materialize, partly because we just weren't in our buildings until April and May. And so we really just had a lot less expenses. And so our E&D was, which is like reserves for the town, was much higher. We have a maximum allowable of E&D that's allowed to us as a result of the action of the last school committee. We're returning money back to the town of Amherst on the order of about $380,000. Which reduced the burden of this year's assessment to the town. That amount of support for the budget from E&D will not be as high next year. We typically have about $500,000 worth of support there, so it's a little higher this year. That will be a concern as we head into next year. That we, as we go into fiscal 24, we won't have quite as much ability to support the budget, but nonetheless, we had it available this year, and still feel like that's a reasonable mechanism to keep ourselves at a level services budget for fiscal 23.
Bob, anything else?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, Mandy?
Yes, thank you. First, I want to thank you for providing the 174-page budget to us. That's something I've been looking for a while, and it was fantastic. It's much better than last year's just line item with all the graphs and explanations and inclusion of revolving funds and all of that. So thank you for that. And I want to apologize for the harshness I might have taken out on you on my frustration last council meeting for not having found that or seen that. So so thank you for having it. It was very helpful for me to help understand this budget. So I have a question that relates to what Kathy was asking, and then something similar to that. The staffing changes look like the staff has gone up about 8% in increase in staffing from FY19 to FY23. Yet our school enrollment has gone down 5%. And most of that staffing increase appears to be in the special education department. I've noticed in this budget that the ESSER funds are funding about 6 staff members this coming year, and that school choice funds have increased tremendously. That in the revolving fund for school choice, you're actually supporting the budget more than in typical years, at least it looked like to me, on school choice funds, and that includes supporting even more staffing of the middle and high school through those school choice funds. And so I'm concerned when is the support level at the school choice funds for the operating budget sustainable? Number one, and then again with the ESSER funds, if we've moved that support level to 6-7 members, school choice is another 11, I think. So we're looking at like 18 staff members supported by funds that may or may not be there in 2 years or may not be able to be at that level. And then in addition to that, while we're losing students, we're increasing our staffing. I just want you to speak to, you covered a little bit about the ESSER staffing and all, but how do we transition away from, the ESSER funds supporting 6 staff members when they disappear in 2 years? And can you explain also why the staffing seems to be increasing by 8% over 5 years while those students are decreasing by 5%? And that's the overall student population. Maybe some of it relates to the SPED student population. I just don't know. I couldn't find those numbers. So that's one question or group of questions I have, is it seems like the staffing level is not compatible with or following the trend of enrollments. And then the next one that relates to that is in the budget, you had a nice graph about the percentage of budgets dedicated to various sections of the budget: regular education, special education, transportation, school administration, facilities, all of that. And I noticed something that over the last 4 years, the actual dollar amount spent on regular education has decreased, not by like the actual dollars. And it's only one of 3 areas that the actual dollars have decreased. And so that concerns me, that we're spending less money on the bulk of students getting their education and more money on nearly every other category. The only other categories that actually decreased were school administration and facilities. So can you talk about why the actual spending in regular education over the last 4 years in actual dollar amounts, this is not, set for inflation or anything, has gone down, and how that, how those choices are made to spend less money on regular education and more money on various other areas within the budget?
Okay, so hopefully I'll get all of those in this answer. So I'll start with this sort of school choice. School choice is traditionally and will remain to be a fairly steady source of income for the regional schools. We have used it to support staffing. We traditionally use it in the regional schools in our mathematics departments. The number of FTE may fluctuate in some respects by virtue of who our staff are and what they cost. And so the FTE varies depending on who our staff are and what sort of grade and step they're at. So it does vary a little bit, just independent of how many dollars we commit to it by virtue of what the cost of those staffing are. That being said, it is a higher level of support from school choice. We've been conservative in our use of school choice for the last couple of years, and so we have more in our revolving fund of school choice funds, and so we can go and be a little more aggressive with our spending in school choice this coming fiscal year, again, with the goal of not making any cuts to staffing or services that we provide to students. And so as far as sustainability of that level of funding, probably not at that high a level, but it'll be close to that level over the next several years. We have a healthy balance there. We have a number of school choice students, but we'll have to manage that, and we're utilizing those funds much like we're using ESSER funds to help us as we transition to having the 6th grade in to the middle school, and that'll be an area where we can probably reduce our use of school choice funds in the future. As far as ESSER funds and the FTE associated with that, many of those staff are staff that have been brought on to deal with particular items of concern relative to the pandemic. And so some of those staff are likely not to be needed as we transition through the pandemic and into its endemic phase. So we're hopeful that some of that staffing will change and not be necessary as we move ahead. So some of what you see with regard to that boost in staffing is some hires specifically to deal with pandemic-related needs of the students. At the same time, there's been a transition in schedule at the high school to a block schedule, and so in working through sort of what are the needs and demands of staffing for that schedule and preserving the elective structure that we'd like to have for students, that's held steady. The number of staff that are needed to provide all those courses. And so I think that's part of what you're seeing as well, as far as the staffing numbers sort of holding steady or maybe even potentially increasing. As far as the sort of shift in spending relative to regular education versus special education, oftentimes with and other parts of the budget. I mean, most of our software that we have gone on to schedules where they increase their software fee by 4% per year. Insurance, property insurance went up 10% this last year. So we have some inflationary pressure in some other areas of the budget that you can't, sort of avoid. So they drive the budget by virtue of their need. A lot of those areas that I just mentioned are not huge parts. I mean, software is a fairly significant component of our budget, but other areas are not as big. But there are several that have had that sort of increase that's above, 2.5% or so that we can usually afford. I think also when you talk to the transition potentially from to more spending on special education, I think that's driven by the needs of the students. And so there's some, there are compulsory aspects of what we do and providing a free and appropriate public education to students. And so that drives, and those individualized education plans drive some of the choices we have to make relative to staffing to meet the needs of those students. And so that does sometimes increase our cost in that area. And to be honest, over the last several years, we've had to make reductions, and so those reductions are manifest in some of that regular education spending that has, we endeavor to make those cuts in ways that have the least impact on students, the least profound impact on students. And so that's the process that we go through, is to try to find ways to reduce in order to come up with a balanced budget and stay within our financial guidelines and resources in a way that has least impact on students and yet still preserves a lot of the things we're trying to do from a programmatic standpoint. There's one other point now, if I can remember that. Sorry.
Well, Doug, I can jump in while you're thinking. Of the last thing you want to say. I think Mandy Joe's question. We use first names in school committee. I hope that's okay for the counselors. I've gotten into the habit of it. I made a deliberate shift this past year to do that. I think there was 3 years ago that we saw a significant shift of students with special education needs that were serviced by paraeducators from the Amherst to the regional level. It was a very difficult year for the region and was actually probably the best year for the Amherst public schools as a result, because the number of paraeducators, the delta between the two districts was, I think, in the order of magnitude of 6 or 7. So some of the staffing trends are reflected are cohorts of students who have had more significant adult support needed to access the curriculum than typical. And we saw a full swoop of them a couple of years ago. And because our districts are organized the way they are, it was very visible that one grade level went through. We also are seeing an increase in parent referrals and have seen since school was closed and during the lockdown. And I think that's a reality. I think the other thing, and I want to acknowledge your point, is we have decided as a committee, as a community, to add staffing in areas. The middle school and high school each have a restorative practices position. That didn't exist before, right? And that doesn't come under regular education. It's like, I forget the category, but more like mental health support, because the community was asking it. And I think that the council certainly can reflect and probably relate to community feedback on similar areas that you all are experiencing in the past year or two. And I think the last thing I want to say, and I said this, I'm not saying it to be flip, Mandy Joe, I said the same thing at the council meeting, is the school committee requested that we provide a level services budget for this year. So we provided a level service budget. And I think you rightly point out, and has been talked about ad nauseum in this district, but more in one of my other districts of late, that this is not a sustainable path, and that over time we're going to have to make some very difficult decisions. Because right now we're not operating. I'm not as worried about E&D and choice because the number of choice students, if we want to take more choice students, we could. That's, we have flexibility on that, but we don't have flexibility on ESSER lasting forever. So I think to your point. And I think that's feedback that, certainly Doug and I can bring back to the school committee at the regional level. It's something we're aware of. And, at this level of ESSER funding support, it feels a little more comfortable than one of my other districts. And I think I've been pretty public about that. So I think you're right to note that the path of sustainability isn't quite clear at the moment. We do have some structural changes in terms of 6th grade moving up, and some cost sharing with the Amherst Elementary School District and how that works. We also have some class sizes, grade levels that are quite smaller, and about, you look at 4th grade down, you see a significant drop in enrollment. And so we do anticipate some efficiencies that can be realized once the students hit the region, but it's going to be a couple of years till they hit the region. And, I think we're trying to figure out how to bridge that gap until we get there, until some of those other changes occur.
So the other thing I was just going to add is relative to the change in enrollment for the regional school district. And really what we saw, and I think this has happened statewide, is our enrollment in 18, 19, and 20, so fiscal years 18, 19, and 20 was basically flat within 3 or 4 kids of each other in each year. And then with fiscal 21 and 22, we've seen a significant drop. And of course, statewide, that's happened with the pandemic, a significant drop, in enrollment. And it's just a little, and so I think that sort of, when you compare your, 5 years ago versus now, it wasn't a steady decline. It was sort of level, and then a shift, sort of a step change in students. And it takes a bit for us to react and absorb that kind of change and modify our staffing levels to accommodate that. But nonetheless, if our student levels stay lower like they are now, we'll continue to refine and contract in some ways and try to maintain our richness of programming that we have for students, but at the same time understand that we can't have necessarily everything because we just don't have the number of students we've had in the past.
Andy, do you have anything follow up, or otherwise I'll go ahead and ask from Matt.
Hey, good morning. Thanks, Andy. This is great. I really want to echo what Mandy Jo said about the giving us the full line item budget. We really appreciate that, and thoughtful narrative and all the work that went into it. Really, I mean, it's above and beyond, I think, what I was expecting. So just really grateful for that. I guess I had a couple quick points and then a question. First of all, I just want to give you all a lot of credit, Mike, on the programmatic side. Seeing the sped tuition revenues going up the way that they are really reflects such an incredible amount of work on your part, on the staff's part. That's a real difference maker when it comes to regional school districts, and it's also a major expense suppressant, because I mean if we have programs available, then a lot of the uncertainty that comes from new sped tuitions, really it helps us control for that a little bit. So I just give you guys a lot of credit for all the hard work you've done on that front. And of course, that also connects to what was said about the special ed staffing. So I do notice, the numbers have gone up on that staffing, and I was just looking at our state profile. We are for our student percentages, we're higher than our neighbors would be for our special education population, and we're lower than the state rates for our economically disadvantaged. So we're kind of an outlier when it comes to high incidence of special education rates, which is just kind of a fact of life. But I think I noticed a few more psychologists added to that budget, and things like that really are necessary and can be cost containers in the long run. So and also they're hard to find, as we were talking about the CREST program a couple months ago. I mean, that's not an easy staffing position to fill, and having one in the long run is it's a good investment, I would say. So I give you all a lot of credit for this. I do share some of the concerns around how ESSER bridges versus boost that level, but I think nobody in this call is unaware of some of those challenges coming up. And the only question I have is maybe a little sort of in the weeds, as they say, but I noticed that we had a Medicaid expansion reference early on, to the IEP students. I'm sorry, Medicaid reimbursement reference to the IEP students. And I know Doug and I'm sure y'all are familiar, but Medicaid expanded a few years, and particularly for districts where we do have a lot of clinical services. Any student who has services from eligible providers is eligible for a Medicaid reimbursement. And I'm just wondering if that is something that y'all just hadn't updated in the narrative in the opening, or if we're not pursuing the Medicaid expansion funds, because depending on where you work, that can be a pretty significant chunk of reimbursement.
I would suggest the narrative hasn't been updated. I can almost guarantee that I didn't review that as closely and put that in there, but nonetheless, we certainly pursue any and all Medicaid dollars that we can. And if you look at sort of recent history of Medicaid, reimbursements have gone down. Part of that was just the pandemic. We weren't physically in spaces with kids to do those services in a lot of ways, and so our eligible costs that we could get reimbursed for were a lot lower in the last couple of years. Those are returning to pre-pandemic levels with being in school all year. But I think I probably failed to update the nuance of the narrative in the book. So I'll take that and try to make that correction.
Thank you. Okay, great.
Anything else, Matt? I do want to ask a question. Whoever signed on about 10 or 15 minutes ago using Lynn's sign-in and has just the P on the screen, it would be helpful to, okay. Thank you, because we needed to know who that was for the sake of the minutes. Since Sean is keeping the minutes, he is to know who's here. So thank you very much. And if you want to change your name on the screen, you can do so. And in any event, what we're doing now is continuing with questions just in order of all present. Dorothy, I think you're next.
Yes. Hi. And I'm in my car because the cleaning lady is in the house. And that's the only way I can do the meeting right now. I just wanted to speak up for regular education, which does not have as strict rules as special education. I guess I was a little perturbed at the example of the school nurse cost saving with a larger group. I just want to remind you that regular students at this time are, I'm sure, increasingly acting up, and there's a lot of silent suffering. And school nurses are the place that many students just go all the time just for solace, even when they're not sick. They just go to sit in the nurse's office to calm down a little bit. And I understand the budget tightness and all of the things, but I'm hoping that more counselors, therapy, nurses, and whatever will be available to the regular ed students because they need it. So thank you.
I can respond to that just briefly. And I'm sorry, I should clarify the comment with the nurses. We're not looking to reduce nurses. It's just the same number of students next year or a year and a half from now, they'll just be structured differently. And that'll happen again 2 years after. So it's really about cost sharing between the districts. It wasn't a reduction of nurses. And as Matt indicated, we've increased our mental health support that's accessible to all students, not just special education students. And I think the last thing to note is that, the change in the high school schedule to the block does create some efficiencies. And so our class sizes remaining very, very comparable or better than comparable to neighboring districts at the secondary level and at the high school, which I'm speaking about specifically. The change to the block schedule allowed for students to spend more of their day in class, which is a good thing. There's less passing periods, and passing periods are the bane of many school administrators' experiences, but also it's lost learning time. And actually, because of the way the schedule functions, allows us to even out class size in a way where our class size is better than it was 2 years ago at the high school level. And that's not with adding staff. That's just more efficient use of staffing. So I do want to note that, Mandy Jo's point is absolutely well taken. But at the same time, we're not seeing classes of 35 or, our average class size is in the low 20s. We provided a report for the regional school committee in the fall that detailed that by class, by individual class, as well as by content area. So I don't want anyone leaving the meeting feeling like all the class sizes are full at 32 students. That's not our high school. That's not our secondary school system. We've been able to realize some efficiencies over time, both by change in schedule and reduction in student enrollment. But we've retained very low class size, which is important for all of our students, our regular ed and special education students.
Thank you.
Lynn?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the detailed budget. It actually was available. We just didn't post it. And but we were able to find it with Doug's help and send it out. This may be a fairly complicated question. So let me preface it by saying, you were able to demonstrate during the discussion of the program for the new elementary school a serious change in how you deal with special ed, and that has led to the ability to keep more special ed students in district rather than send them out. Personally, I want to thank you for that. Being the parent of a special ed student, putting a most vulnerable kid on a bus to go an hour away is not my idea of a good time or a good decision. So have you taken that model to the high school? And does that model in the high school, therefore, reflect in some of the increased special ed costs? So that's one question. And then I want to be very careful not to suggest that I want to signal out special ed, because I think signaling out special ed has many, many downsides. But when you provide us with staffings and student and budget trends, could you, in fact, also provide us with trends regarding special ed students and indicate in those budgets when you began to expand to the more in-district services that you now provide than what you would then otherwise? And again, I want to be really clear. This is not to suggest we shouldn't be doing this. It's not to try to tell you how to run your schools. It is to try to help understand what some of the impacts are on our budget. So thank you.
I can do the first part and I'll turn to Doug for the second part. So to answer your question, yes, we've built out our programs in special education at the middle school and high school level as well. We have much less significant. It's funny with the state data because when you compare it, we have a split district. Most districts, and we're no different, see a higher percentage of out-of-district placements at the secondary level than the elementary level, just because the nature of secondary students, it's harder to engage depending on students' needs in a high school schedule of courses than it is in second grade. Just the inclusion opportunities are a little more present. So that said, we have a robust set of specialized programs. We spent a fair bit of funds a couple of years ago to reform and improve our program for our most disabled students at the high school with some infrastructure improvements at the space, as well as staffing pieces along with it. So to answer your question, absolutely. And more recently, especially in our 9th grade programs, a little bit in our 10th grade programs, we've worked on a co-teaching inclusion model that's been very, very successful at that grade level. Once you get to the elective programs, 11th and 12th grade, so the management of that becomes a little more challenged. But at a core courses, we're doing incredible amount more inclusion than we were 5-6 years ago. And that's thanks to good work of Talib, Mickey Gramacki at the high school, Sam Camera, but also Faye Brady, our student services director. And I want to be honest that we have more students who go out of district, and that's the nature of secondary schools. We're still well below the mean. If you look at secondary schools, and you can access some of this data, not all of it, some of it in the state website. They're not designed for multiple districts sharing a central office the way that you and many other districts in Western Mass have set it up, but well below the mean on that if you look across the state. I'll let Doug jump in on kind of how that's reflected in the budget documents, but I really appreciate the question and the framing.
The only thing I'll add is that, we certainly can put together, as I put together the sort of request from earlier, I can add in some of the requests relative to trends in special education students. I think one of the tricky things there is we want to make sure not to, identify anybody in that process. As you start to get into some of those things, the numbers start to get small, they start to get identifiable. We'll definitely avoid that in that regard. But certainly, identifying what those trends have been like and what kind of programming we've done and when we've sort of implemented certain aspects of programming over the recent years. I'll just echo what the superintendent said, and that is the number of students we have, although more in our secondary versus our elementary that are in out-of-district placements, the number we have relative to many other districts is considerably lower. And so it's those programs I would suggest are very cost effective for us.
So can I do a follow-on, Andy?
Sure.
Okay. I also want to add that this is not in any way to diminish the regular program. When you do the comparison, is there any way to look at if you had to send those students out of district, what it would cost compared to keeping those students? I don't mean the ones you're already sending out, but I mean the ones that probably you're now able to accommodate that you weren't able to accommodate 6 years ago. Okay, that's a little bit of comparison, because somebody might say, well, if it means an extra teacher, then why not pay the tuition going out? The second question is, when you do tuitioning in, clearly Amherst is a very attractive district to tuition in if you're special ed. Do you get more money for that? And should you get more money for that? And what should we be doing about that?
So I'll answer that in some. I think as far as comparing sort of kids that are retained in district versus being sent out of district, it will be imperfect, but nonetheless, I think we can make that kind of a comparison just to sort of see what that delta is between those two. It's not sort of cut and dried. These kids would, these kids would. It's a bit variable in that regard. Regarding the tuition in question, yeah, we have a couple of programs that do take students from other districts. As far as sort of setting a price, we do charge those districts. It's not the school choice sort of $5,000 kind of thing. It's we go through the process of determining what our program costs and administrative costs. We have to stay competitive in some respects. I mean, it sounds weird. It's sort of like, thinking in terms of a profit center, but it's not really. What we're looking to do is try to cover costs that we would incur if the students comes to our program. So we do factor those things in and reevaluate and assess those towns based on what we need to cover our costs. There is some, of course, economy of scale we get sometimes when we bring another student in, so that's helpful to our district in that regard. But it's really about, I think if you spoke to some of our program leaders in that, it's about finding the right match for the student and getting them the best education they can. And that's really the sort of primary focus, and the fact that we can offset those costs with tuition is just, to sort of make sure that home district and our district are kind of holding our own and covering the costs that we're responsible for.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to vary the order because we have a couple people who've asked to be recognized second time. With Bernie Kubiak, you haven't spoken yet and asked any questions, so I'll recognize Bernie next.
Thanks, Andy. And I do want to congratulate and thank Mike and Doug and they're in a difficult position. They're stuck between multiple committees and they've got to maneuver through all that. And I really appreciate their collaborative approach to this rather than a combative approach. And it's really refreshing given my experience with other school districts. So thank you, gentlemen. I'm a long history in working with special needs folks, and the question I have is in terms of state reimbursement. I know there's a threshold. I know that threshold varies, and I'm wondering if what that threshold is and how much reimbursement we can expect in future years, because this is always backward looking for our special ed efforts right now. And the second question I have, this morning was announced that CPI inflation on the consumer price index is like 8.4%. Doug, you touched very briefly on inflation's impact, but there are other, inflation tends to hit governments a little harder, government operations a little harder because of the way services are purchased. And I'd like you to expand just a little bit more on your comments on inflation impact on the budget. Thank you.
Sure. So I can, take that last question first. I think a little bit, we try to anticipate, and we get some information from some of our vendors relative to the, cost increases that they're seeing or they're anticipating for us. And so we try to factor that into our budgets when and where we can. Obviously, unexpected cost increases are obviously very, very difficult to deal with. And so, that's where, our sort of management of the budget during the year, and I think this coming year is going to be really difficult in that regard, is going to be tricky because, there's just going to be some costs that are, higher and significantly higher in some areas than they've been in the past, and will sort of outstrip what we budgeted. And so we'll have to sort of conserve in some other areas to meet the need and to cover the costs. So in that regard, it's quite difficult. It will be difficult in this, sort of anytime the cost increases are happening rapidly, they're much harder to accommodate. Price decreases, which don't have that off, but are welcome and much easier to deal with. But nonetheless, it's going to, if inflation continues on the track it has been over the last several months in particular, it will prove to be a challenging year to manage the budget as we go ahead. To your question about lost the train of thought.
State reimbursement for sped.
Oh, the reimbursement, yes. So the current threshold for that, it's called the circuit breaker program in special education. The current threshold is in the about $45,000 range. So we have to spend about $45,000 before any money is eligible for reimbursement. Once you get above that threshold, then the state reimburses at a percentage of those costs. So they try to reimburse the special education costs at about 75%. In the last couple of years, they've added transportation costs as eligible costs as well. So once they've reimbursed 75% of those eligible special education costs, then 25% of the transportation costs are eligible for reimbursement. And they're going to work towards higher levels of reimbursement on those is the goal. But nonetheless, you have to incur in-house a fairly significant level of expense before you can begin to have eligible costs. Year over year, I mean, it varies depending on the number of students that sort of hit that threshold for us. But year over year in the regional schools, that amount of money is in the $600,000 to $800,000 range. And it's a lagging indicator because we do the work in one year, they reimburse us the next, we budget it the following year. So and as student population in that in that category of extraordinary expense changes, then those numbers go up and down. We try to leverage those funds in a coherent way and budget for them accordingly and help reduce our sort of future costs based on our past efforts. But it's a pretty significant support to the budget, and obviously if the state were to fund that reimbursement at a higher level, would be very, very beneficial to ourselves and pretty much every other district in the Commonwealth.
Kathy?
Thanks, Andy. I have a question based on just seeing something in the newspaper, but that we have this new CREST program that we've opened up in the town, and it looks like it was helpful to bring in the current director, the recently hired director, into the high school. Do you see when ESSER funds run out? I think one of the things you said is that you were staffing up during this time period as people came back because of pandemic impact. Will that program potentially be of use to the regional school system? I said and or local. So it's sort of a question looking into the future, because it is staffing. Well, you know what it is. It's staffing with mediation, with mental health skills, with talking with people, restorative justice, trying to work through conflict. So it's is there any synergy with that program is my question.
Yeah, I think Earl would be best to answer that question, but I can share that I did have a meeting 2 weeks ago, perhaps with Earl, the director, and with Talib at the high school, and there was another one, one of Earl's colleagues as well. I think what I heard and what we know is that oftentimes the challenges we see in school are integrally connected with the challenges that are existing in the community. So from his perspective, and I share that, if you're going to address one, you sort of have to address the other, right? And I think it was interviewed, I'm not sure what made it into the paper today, about some of the challenges a few weeks ago at the high school is, I think the days of when many of us were in high school or in school and conflicts actually originated in school, that's something that never happens, but it pretty rarely happens. It's really challenges that existing in the community and online community coming into school. And that's what we see on a more regular basis. And so I hope that we're able to maintain the level of dialogue that we've started. I found just boots on the ground, let me show up, let me meet kids. And I think there was a real commitment also about training anyone in the community, but inclusive of our middle school and high school students on active bystander work, of anti-racism work. And that really connects to a lot of the work we're doing in the district with a different lens. Frankly, many of the high schools in the United States, I would say most, maintain public safety officer in our schools. Our regional school committee has never allowed for that, or at least not in the last 25 years. I can't go back that far or further than that. And we have a good relationship with the Amherst Police Department. I don't want to suggest that we don't, but we don't have a regular presence. And so this is a different opportunity for us to think through. And I just appreciate Talib and Earl's willingness to engage, Earl's willingness to be present and make some relationships with students. And what we say is they're often the same relationships that would need to be formed within our communities. Just we have a captive audience in school, right? It's less captive audience in the community. And so I think it's in everyone's best interest that we're making those connections and building those bridges between Crest and the schools and the community, and just really happy to have partners who are eager and excited to be working together on it.
Okay. Sean, you had your hand up, and I didn't know if you were.
Yeah, I was only going to say that we should think about moving to capital pretty soon, only because we have Amy and Guilford in the audience for the next agenda item. So. Yeah, no, I was thinking about that too. I want to wrap this section up. I have a couple of counselors who are still have questions, and I may or may not ask one afterwards, but we do need to move along to capital. But Mandy?
Actually, that was part of my questions, which is I have a lot of questions that don't necessarily relate to the operating budget. They're more revolving fund questions or use of revolving funds and things like that. How should I email Andy to forward them on to get answers? Where do I send those questions? Because they're not directly related to operating. So that's my first question. And then I guess I wanted to follow up on my other question about just the portion of the budget dedicated to any particular area. You know, there are certain things, as Doug said, that are non-discretionary spending that just go up. Health insurance, we can't do anything about it, right? You know, transportation costs, you have a contract, you can't do anything about it. And by state law, you have to provide something. But by state law, you have to provide a free and appropriate education for all students, not just special education students. And so I am concerned that as those non-discretionary spending increases and puts pressure on the whole budget, that the decision is being made to cut regular education, but not cut special education, and that pressure on the budget is being felt unequally between the students in regular education and the students in special education. So that was where I was trying to go with the question as to why are we spending less in actual dollars, not even real dollars, this year than 5 years ago, because I fear the regular education students and that part of the program is taking the brunt of the pressure that all budgets, you know, especially in this inflationary period, all budgets are going to face massive pressure when you decide where to put that money. And so that I just have a concern about that it's being taken and you know, the brunt of that pressure is being experienced on the regular education side than the special education side. And I don't know whether that's true, but in looking at the budget, that's somewhat of potentially what I see.
Just a quick response to that concern. So we have not cut regular education in the budget. We're not cut any positions this year. A couple of years ago, we did have some shifts. We also a cut it's hard to realize in a budget book as we move Summit Academy from the old building into the high school. There's I think the reason it's hard to realize is that reduction was 6 digits. And it repeats every year. In other words, if we hadn't made that shift, we would still have a lot of staffing that we don't currently need. So you don't show that every year, but the reality is it was a structural change. I think this is going to sound nitpicky, I suppose, but when students have IEPs and they talk about services, you know, I don't view that as discretionary, right? It's not like I can say, no, we're going to cut the budget, therefore you're no longer going to get math special education services. That's not in the discretionary part of what Doug or myself are able to do. And I think the challenge of special ed is, right, that happens in IEP meetings that occur every day throughout the school year. And those decisions are made by team meetings as defined by the state. And so I definitely get the larger point, but I think when we look at discretionary spending, we rarely have a lot of flexibility within special education because it's based on IEPs that are signed and formed by a team as per, you know, the state protocol. And so I think that's one of the reasons you're not seeing a lot of cuts in special education is that, you know, most of the costs related to special education are not discretionary. But I don't mean to pick on the word you use, but I think it is just a useful distinction because it's our reality. So.
Thank you. I don't see any hands up at the moment. I know that Jennifer, you had your hand up, but then took it down again. So you okay, or did you have something?
No, I can email in my question.
Okay, so thank you for saying that, because that was how I was going to conclude this. Mandy raised the same question, which is, if you have questions that you think of that you'd like to pose later, if it's okay with Mike and Doug, what I would suggest is that we try and assemble any additional questions and forward them so that we don't prolong this morning. If you could email them to me, I will share them with Lynn and Sean, and we will try and put the questions together if there are additional questions, and forward them. And it would be helpful to set a deadline, and maybe a week from today might be the best way for if you have additional questions, so that we have time to then do something and get them along during the vacation week. Lynn?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that as you compile questions and we get answers, those answers would be made available to all counselors and to the public.
Yes, I think we should make it clear that anything that comes in the way of questions and answers would need to be public accessible information, because this is part of the meeting of the whole. So with that, let's try and get on to the capital questions. And I don't know if either Mike or Doug want to say anything initially about the capital before we open that up to questions. Doug?
Yeah, I think I just want to be clear about the pieces of the puzzle we have here. So there's the capital assessment, which is shown in this slide, right? Get the right one here, and particularly the line right there, 388, 331. That's for debt that has already been issued, capital projects that have been approved and are either in process or completed, and we borrowed the money in order to accomplish those. And so that's part of the budget. That's an assessment that we'll be paying debt that is already incurred. What you see in the upper part of this screen is the new debt authorization that we are asking for to do capital projects. There's about $160,000 of sort of standard or classic capital projects, and then there's the Fields and Track project. And we did those the school committee did those authorizations in sort of two steps, and part of that's because the $160,000 is sort of the standard authorization we asked for, and the standard process and kind of programs that we asked for. And so that's one. Because the nature of the track project is a little more complex, that authorization was done separately, and it has sort of two pieces to it. But the key thing to keep in mind, I think, is that it's an authorization for $1.5 million in borrowing for a track project. There are two sort of flavors of that. There's, and either or options that are available. There's no decisions that's been made yet relative to which ones. It is dependent, but that language that we use for that authorization that the school committee did allows for the exploration of different options relative to how to execute on the need there. The critical piece is that the track as it currently exists is becoming unusable. Is not able to host track meets, home track meets. It's becoming more and more difficult to be usable for PE classes as well as even practice for track. So there's need to take action relative to that. And of course, in a larger scheme, it would be advantageous to rotate its orientation so that the interior field is facing a north-south direction, which is a much more playable circumstance and creates a much better utilization of the fields and space around the school. But nonetheless, the critical question that we're asking is for the authorization to borrow in order to do a project. Which project will play out over time? So I think I'll stop there and let you guys sort of pose what other questions you might have. But I wanted to draw the distinction between the assessment that we need authorization for, which is a budgetary thing and payment of sort of debts owed and will be coming due, and then the authorizations, which is for new borrowing for future projects and needs.
Okay. Sean, did you?
Yeah, I'll just add that there was a request at the presentation to the council. We had combined these into one financial order. There was a request to separate the track and field from the other projects, and Sonia has gone ahead and done that. So for the hearing and the subsequent finance committee meeting, we'll provide you with the two separate capital orders or two separate debt authorizations, for one for the track and field and then one for everything else.
And the plan for the track and field is that you're seeking additional donations and other funding to see if so that to build on the base amount and do the larger project. And are you planning to approach Amherst CPA committee and other CPA committees to as a part of that effort?
Yes is the short answer. So we're obviously, if we can leverage CPA from each of the communities, we'll go back to the Amherst CPA. I'm scheduled to go to the Pelham CPA meeting. The Leverett Tewksbury CPA meet on a different cycle. I'll probably engage with them as I engage with their community about other levels of funding they might be able to provide from other sources, whether it be CPA funds, ARPA funds, reserves, whatever other mechanisms they might have to help support this project. So we'll be working with each of the 4 towns to find those other resources that sit sort of external to the traditional regional assessment method, but would be necessary in order to do a larger project. And so that's a bit of work that's in process, and we're definitely reaching out to any and all sort of sources and each of the 4 communities.
Okay, we go to councilor questions on the capital, and then if need to come back for explanation. But Dorothy?
I would like to suggest a slightly different angle on the fundraising effort for the track. Instead of going to community sources, which are contested for other causes, I think this is a great naming opportunity for somebody with a lot of money to pay for most of it. Just, I mean, really the big bucks, because some people are not happy with the fancy track competing for CPA money with other causes. And yet there are other people who'd love to have the track named after them. So I'm wondering if you're looking at the big donors as well as the usual donors.
I think the short answer is, yeah, we absolutely are looking at those types of things. The conversations we've had today with some of the fundraisers that have been looking at those types of things, those kind of options, whether they be a larger single donor or multiple large donors, certainly avenues of exploration that are currently going on, and we're happy to entertain any and all of those options and those ideas. And likewise, we would look at, there are traditionally national organizations that provide grants. We did that a few years ago with the tennis courts here at the middle school. USTA had a fairly significant grant program and put very modest limitations on us. If we can find similar ones like that, we'll use those as well. So we'll definitely seek those kinds of opportunities.
Okay, well, thank you. So just think big, that's all.
Mandy?
Thank you. A couple of questions. That the debt schedule that's on the screen right now that was in the presentation is different in numbers than the debt schedule on page 164 of the budget. And I know some of it's because there's a lot of projected debt in the other one. But so the question is, the one on the screen doesn't actually include the borrowing for the $1.5 million for the track project, I think, if I'm looking at it. Question on the page 164's debt budget projection says it includes the track borrowing at various levels, but I couldn't find it as separately set out. So that's just am I missing it somewhere? Where is it included? The 10-year budget has window and door replacements at $10 million at the high school, with the roof being only $5 million. I'm having trouble understanding how the roof is, how windows and doors cost double the amount of the roof. So that would be helpful for me. And then the debt schedule on 164 stops with projections at FY27, it says, which means the roof in FY28, the windows in FY30 aren't even on this debt projection schedule. And so one of my big questions is, these numbers get big, not just for Amherst, but for Pelham, for Leverett, for Shutesbury, in this 10-year plan, and don't even include a 17 million in borrowing starting in FY28 and FY30. Is it even possible for not just Amherst, but Pelham, Shutesbury, and Leverett to pay the assessments if all of this would happen? Such that, is this even a logical plan? And then as it relates to the track, I'm having a lot of concern or struggle with the fact that we are being asked to authorize borrowing for a project we don't know which one we'll be going for. So the question I have is, because to me, a project for just replacing the track is much different than reorienting, doing a grass turf field that will allow a lot more heavy use on the fields and all of that. And I have different thoughts about them. And so why are we being asked to authorize the borrowing before all of the fundraising has been done and we can be told exactly which project is being done? Why do we need to authorize the borrowing now? Why did the school committee go forward with that instead of figure out whether they could raise the money and then come back with, this is the project we're doing?
So taking a few of those in different order. So excuse me. The previous slide that was up that showed the sort of the debt over the coming years does include $1.5 billion in borrowing. It doesn't hit the budget until fiscal 24. So the borrowing happens in 23. The actual first payment doesn't hit until 24. It includes the roof project at the middle school, which comes online that same year. I think the difficulty and what needs to happen relative to this, and I haven't had the opportunity to do that, is to balance out the sort of debt over time. It does get to be a bit overwhelming. We've heard that from the other the other three communities as well. It's a pretty high spike in the coming years. Relative to those two larger projects, the high school, the roof, and the windows and doors, I'll say this: in both circumstances, we apply for MSBA programs like we have been for the middle school roof. It's likely that will push out how far into the future those will be, and they will provide some support relative to reducing that cost. In the current sort of projection, we're taking on the full cost. Just as an example, the windows and door project here at the middle school, I think, was in the order of close to $6 million, and the estimates for the roof on this building are in the sort of $3 million range. And so, there's roughly that double. Windows and doors are, for whatever reason, I think they're fairly expensive, and they're also, a lot more labor's involved in getting them installed and that sort of thing. So that's why the scale of what you see at the high school, it's a much larger physical building and a lot more windows and doors to be replaced potentially there. But in both those cases, they're very broad and rough estimates at this point. I think they're also likely to get pushed further out into the future. And there are other projects within that capital plan that will get adjusted depending upon when some larger projects come online or don't come online. So we have some larger paving projects and that sort of thing that we'll do probably in smaller chunks, and also potentially depending on when, say, the roof would get the MSBA reimbursement support, would impact when that happens. So again, on what's showing here, there's a slight adjustment to fiscal 23 that went down a little bit by virtue of some refinement of some numbers and some higher paying off of principal, and so the amount of debt that we have is a little bit less. As far as the out years, as currently sort of structured, yes, this is a pretty aggressive and expensive plan and will necessarily require some fine tuning to be able to be affordable by the communities, Amherst and the other three. So I recognize that, and we'll need to refine that as we move ahead and get a little more specifics about the different things. As far as the authorization, the debt authorization and the request for the authorization at this point in time, regional school committee can authorize debt at any point in time, but they have it in a 60-day sort of clock starts relative to each town's ability to accept or reject that. If they take no action, it's a pocket approval. And traditionally, anytime we've asked for borrowing from the four communities, we do it on cycle. And so there's not typically or not always fall town meetings. So we traditionally do our debt authorization such that it hits all the spring town meetings and gives every town an opportunity to weigh in whether they're okay or not okay with that authorization. So that's part of why it's coming before you at this point in time. The second thing is that the track needs a replacement now. I mean, that's a short story, and it really cannot wait. And so while I think everyone is hopeful to do a larger, more comprehensive project, the reality is that track needs to be replaced sooner than later. And what this does by having authorization now is, and having it structured the way it is now, where it can be either just replacement in place or a larger project, gives a fixed time horizon for us to coordinate and fundraise around those other sources of funds. And so I think that gives us a clear trajectory of timeline for everyone to meet that need and try to raise those funds. We've been kind of pushing off, approaching this project and this problem because of the difficulty of that fundraising and knowing the need for it. And it's been something that we just can't delay any longer. And so that's why the authorization is in front of you now. And it does set a timeline that will require us to sort of step up and meet those needs, both from the communities and their commitments separate from the regional agreement assessments, but also then in fundraising. So I think that's a couple of the reasons why you see that in front of you and in the form that it has at the current time.
If I could jump in just briefly, two things. One is that unfortunately I'm going to have to depart. I think Doug can stay a little later than me, but capital is a good one for Doug to take the lead on because he's much more knowledgeable. But I think I just want to add to what Doug said there in response to the question about why the track. And so I want to be unequivocal that I think it's in the best interest of the region and the community that we do the larger project, for all the reasons that you said, Mandy Jo, right? The turf field would, talking to other superintendents, being in other communities, it transforms not just the athletic program, but the year-round use. I mean, the way facilities are built now, you can build a turf field that it's truly year-round, that can be plowed, can be even the cold winter days. We have kids and I work in a middle school, right? I see kids and how they dress despite the weather. And if there was a field for them to play on, they would play on that field despite being 38 degrees. And we don't have that capability. And not just our students, but our larger community. So I think as a district, and I think the school committee was, I don't want to speak for them, but I was very supportive of that effort. And we have questions about, whether we can pull that off, given other, with all four towns. And so the reason, just to be blunt about it, it's in there is the track needs to be replaced because it's not safe for kids. It's becoming not safe, not just for meets, but for practices. We have a lot of concerns from coaches around that. It needs to happen one way or the other. And so what we didn't want to do was set up a high stakes scenario where if the larger project didn't happen, that we would be back to the drawing board, because we've been in this place for longer than I've been superintendent with this exact problem. And we need to move the track. It's not something that can wait any longer. And much like you, I see the huge benefits that would come from the larger project. And totally am on board, and I'll be out there singing the praises of why, and I've done that at public meetings and will continue to do that. And I want to thank Dave Zolmek and town staff who have also been integral partners in this. I don't want anyone to leave this meeting feeling like this is only a district thing or only district employees have been involved. Dave and others from the town have been heavily involved in these discussions. And Dave obviously knows this for many, many years. So I just wanted to add those points. I do apologize that I do have, I'm now 16 minutes late for a meeting I need to be at. So I do apologize, but Doug, are you okay to stay a bit longer? Because I see there's other hands up on the capital pieces.
Yes, I am.
All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
So Mike, thank you very much for having been with us this morning. We really appreciated your very openness to responding to questions, and we realize that the track and the entire field is an important priority, and we're just trying to understand how to manage it, and really admire your creativity in doing that. So thank you, Mike. I'm going to continue on with
Andy, you're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry. Sean.
Andy, I was going to
please,
say, just given the hour, we might want to switch over to water and sewer regulations and take any remaining questions either through email, or we are going to have another meeting where we can devote a bunch of time to this topic. But we're at 10:30, and I know Amy and Guilford are still with us.
I'm happy to come back too, if you need me to.
Okay. Let me just see if there's is there anyone, leave your hand up if you have a question about capital that you feel needs to be asked now and need a response now, as opposed to submitting them in writing to be grouped as we talked about. And if let's see what they are that are left then. Kathy and Lynn.
Let me just do it in timing. So when is the next, do we have time to have Doug come back? I'm happy to hold my question and send it. It's about the interaction with Sean's 5-year cap and Paul's 5-year capital plan, and where's the money going to come from? But I can send my very specific questions in on both. So would that be the next? I don't want this 60-day. I don't like the idea of these 60-day time limit, ticking, the clock ticking. So do we have time to do this at the next meeting?
So the 26th, this is supposed to be a major agenda item.
So the answer is yes, correct? Okay,
Yeah, I
then
don't know. Let's ask Doug. This is a question for you. Can you join us on the 26th in the morning?
Make sure I'm not muted here. Sorry. I have a hard stop at 10 a.m., but I am available before that.
Okay.
Okay,
Then I'll just send my questions in.
yeah, let's try and do it as much as possible with the questions submitted in advance, so that we adhere to Doug's limit. Lynn?
Yeah, the only concern I have is there's more of a time crunch on this than there are on the regulations. And I really think it's beneficial having 10 counselors in the room to kind of use the opportunity. So I'm questioning whether that's it. I, however, have a question about this that I would like made very public now, and that is, in terms of the 2 track and field plans, is the most that you are asking for in terms of taxation 1.5 million? In other words, if we don't meet the fundraising and other ways of coming up with the rest of the money, that's the maximum you're going to come to Amherst or to the towns for.
Through the regional agreement, yes. If depending on if we explore the larger project, the larger price tag, some of that funding may be tax based, but that'll be determinations of each town to decide what and how, and some of it will be depending upon fundraising. But as far as through the regional agreement, 1.5 is the number that we will use at the sort of upper limit through the regional agreement.
Thank you.
Sean might be able to help with this too in the explanation, but the way the process works, for those who are not quite as familiar with it, we set aside a percentage of the estimated tax revenue that is then available for capital in each year. And the amount that we have commit ourselves for region expenses gets subtracted from that before, and then other debt that we've taken on gets subtracted to that before we can get onto the annual capital requests. So that as we're getting into the major building projects that we have talked about as a council for now, since the council was the first council came into place, and the commitments we've already made to the library and anticipate making for an elementary school DPW facility and fire station. We have to factor all of that together, and it has a balance. And Sean, I don't know if you want to say anything further about that, or because I think at some point we do need to make a presentation for new counselors about how that works and how it's envisioned.
Yeah, so as Andy said, when we do our capital planning, we allocate a certain percentage for capital every year. And the first thing we do is deduct any debt obligations that we have from that amount. And we treat the regional assessment like a debt obligation. It's not technically our debt, but it's effectively the same thing because the council authorized the region to proceed with that debt. So the regional assessment is also deducted from that top line of what we have for capital every year. So whenever the council authorizes debt, you want to understand the impact down the road in terms of what it will do to future capital plans and how much capital is available. For FY23, we have estimated out an increase in the regional assessment. You'll see in the capital improvement program that'll be presented in a few weeks, that we've projected a rise in the regional assessment related to some of these projects. We have not projected it to go all the way up to what you'll see in the regional budget because quite frankly, for some of the reasons that have been described, it would use up all our capital. So I think we have to have more of a discussion about sort of timing and slotting of the projects. And the other towns will have to have that same conversation. But we have projected a pretty substantial increase in the regional assessment starting in a couple of years and going on for some time to factor in some of these projects.
So at some point, and I don't know if you've thought about this, Lynn, but at some point we do need to find a mechanism and a time for a presentation of the entire funding plan for all major capital projects, because we have so many new counselors who have not had the presentation previously.
Thank you. I'll look at our budget, our agendas and see when we can do that.
So there are two people with questions. Let me get to them and then see where we are at that
Andy,
point.
Guilford messaged me that they can come back if we want to just stick. We may be at the point where it doesn't make sense to take them anyway.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
So maybe we just finish this item out and we can invite Amy and Guilford to come back at the next meeting.
Yes.
Okay.
Is that okay with you, Andy?
Yes.
Okay, then Amy and Guilford, if you're listening, we apologize, but you can come back. We'll work with you to schedule agenda item at the next meeting.
So, Kathy, did you have a
Yeah.
question?
Well, I just want to build on what you and Sean started saying. We just went through a JCPC reviewing of all the budgets where we were looking at a 5-year plan. And as Sean knows, it was already not completely imbalanced starting. 23 looks fine. It's 24, 25, 26 that don't look as well. And we've got other big things coming down the pipeline because it was already drawing on reserves. So I don't personally see how we can make a decision on an authorization that goes even higher than what Shauna already had in the budget for the regional schools without a much bigger discussion. So it's not just educate the counselors on it, but we're being asked to make a decision in the next 60 days that, to the extent I understand it, affects a 5 to 10 year capital plan in a way that makes me really uncomfortable. You know, if we, especially if we include the track, Lynn, at even we say it's no more than 1.5 spread over 20 years or 30 years. It was, yes. So I'll just stop there because it feels like I'm willing to come back to this at the next, but this seems like we're making a piece of a decision on a piece without looking at the whole, and that doesn't work well for me. So I can't kind of ask more questions about this other than the two numbers, Doug, when I go back and look at the 10% or the 10.5% we're holding out of the levy, unless you miraculously find that Amherst College or UMass would like to finance our track. You know, I mean, that, you know, Dorothy's idea, there's some deep pockets out there. I don't see how this works within our 23, 24, 25, 26, because any decision we make is a multiple year decision when we do a debt authorization. So I'm just going to stop there on my discomfort on singling out one piece.
Gonna recognize Sean and Lynn first, but I want to just point out that the 60 days is running already, that it's 60 days started on March 15th, and we are committed to May 2nd as the date to make a council decision on this, because we need to do it at a council meeting within the 60-day framework. And Lynn, do you have anything else to add on that?
My comment really was broader than that, so just come back to me later. Thank you.
And Sean?
I was going to ask Lynn if she could put up the track and field PowerPoint again. I just want to point out to people, there's a difference between the debt schedules that are in the regional budget and the debt for this specific project. And I just want to really highlight the debt for this specific project so that you have a sense of what that is on an annual basis. And Doug, you know, thanks to Doug for putting this presentation together.
Is this what you mean, Sean?
Yeah, so if you go down to where I think it talks about the Amherst share. Right there. Good. So this shows you a few things. So one is the local taxation based on the 1.5 million. So that's that bottom table. So it would be roughly, you know, it would peak at 128,000 per year and decline. So this is within what we've projected, Kathy, in that 5-year plan as of right now. I know there's other projects that will go into that, but just so you kind of have a sense, we've projected that debt or assessment for the region going up to 800,000. It's currently at 380 or somewhere in the 300s, and some of that debt will also be paid off in the coming years. So again, when I talked about we've increased it to allow for some of these larger projects, that's what I'm talking about. So this would be within that 800,000, but it will mean trade-offs with other projects. And then the top chart is CPA. So the region already did go to CPA and present this project. CPA put it on hold because they wanted, I think they were interested, the general consensus was, I think, more interest in the larger project, using CPA for the larger project, and less so if it was just the smaller version of the project. So that's what that portion would look like coming out of CPA each year. And then the remaining piece is the town would need to come up with roughly another $1 million or so, or 890,000 in order to meet the Amherst share, and the timeline that Doug talked about. In order for Amherst to meet its share, we'd have to come up with that other source of funds. So that'll require, I think, ongoing conversations about if the town is interested in pursuing this project, where does that come from? There's different sources it could come from. It could come from capital, it could come from reserves, it could come from potentially ARPA, but we need a bigger conversation, I think, to decide. I think some of the discussion I've heard is that in order to do effective fundraising, there needs to be some sign of investment by the town. I think what I've heard is it's harder to fundraise if there's zero investment set aside for the town. So some of these votes to allocate funds to the larger project, I think, go a long way in allowing fundraising to be successful. So just keep that in mind as well. As right now there's zero set aside for this project, or maybe 75,000, Doug, in stabilization from a prior year or something like that, like that set aside for either of these projects. And I think the last thing I'll say is, the options in front of the council are to vote yes, vote no, or do nothing. And if you do nothing, that's effectively a yes vote. If you vote no, all it takes is one town to vote no on the debt authorization for that debt authorization to fail. So a no vote means, sorry, this isn't happening. It has to go back to the school committee.
Okay. Thank you. Lynn, back to you and then to Mandy.
So what this raises for me is the need for us to go back to the larger presentation about overall capital and debt that includes the 4 big capital projects, and a time to do an update with the council. And I'll consult with Paul and Sean as to when we might do that, and so that it is available, and if it can be available in a timely way. It's no small job to update that whole model. But I think that this is raising for all of us the question of our debt ceiling, our debt, what we're asking for in taxes, and the values we have for our community, which is kind of all wrapped up in all of that.
Yes, and of course, eventually, as we move along with the elementary school project, and we're going to be getting into the question of what we ask for voters in a debt exclusion override, which is essentially where we're asking them to allow us to raise more taxes in order to increase the amount that we're borrowing for capital and funding for capital that's not already in the local taxation type of allocation. So these are important issues for the council as a whole. Mandy?
Thank you. As with Lynn, I think we need some more information. I look at the debt budget on 164, which I know is just like estimates and all of that, but on page 164, that combines the projected FY23 debt into FY24, 5, 6, and 7, but yet we're being asked to authorize the FY23 debt. And so I'd like to see a new debt budget debt schedule that includes all the already approved ones, which I think includes the roof debt for the middle school. That's a line that seems like it's projected, but that's already passed, so that's going to happen. FY21 debt has already been authorized. FY22 debt has already been authorized, but FY23 is not set out separately. Please set out separately the fields. Please set out separately the rest of the FY23 debt, and then maybe separately from that 24, 25, 26, and then somehow for Sean incorporate that into our CIP plan, so that we can really see, as it relates to Amherst, what that looks like. And a couple of questions. Didn't last year or the year before the town council authorize and allocate CPA funds to the track project? And so what happened to that? My bigger one is, if the fundraising isn't enough by January, I know you put a deadline in to cover a larger project, do the towns have another opportunity to say, hey, we do want to do it and make up that difference, or not? Or is this vote that final vote? Because I guess I recognize the need to push fundraising forward, the towns to be in it, but right now the towns are just in it with a project, not that project or another project. And so that's part of my concern is you're asking us to authorize 1.5 million without indication as to which project it will go to. And that's, I'm very uncomfortable with that versus authorizing 1.5 million for X project or 1.5 million for Y project, or not, or yes, or both, or, I'm just uncomfortable with, well, if we don't raise the money, we'll spend that anyway on a project that we're not sure the towns support or not. And so I struggle with that and would like to find a way to really say yes to, say, the larger project or no to the larger project. And the way the authorizations and the votes are now, we can't one way or the other because it's just for a project. So we can't indicate our support one way or the other.
So if I may, I'll speak that a little bit. Just back to your original comment about the CPA. Yes, the Amherst CPA did fund, and I'm drawing a blank on the amount. I want to say about $150,000 of CPA funds, and it was required. Its availability for use does include the need to do the larger project that rotates the track. That would reduce this CPA number. This is based on the totality of this, so it's in a sense already 150 or so thousand of that 947 has been approved. This is, there would be an additional ask, quite frankly, for the differential there. And really that's about when we came to the CPA earlier this year, that was the differential was about 800,000. So it's right in the neighborhood of the same total ask of the project for CPA for Amherst. Regarding the other, the thing is that if the regional schools, if they did two distinct authorizations, then and the 4 communities said yes to both of those, now we have an authorization for $3 million, and we have the authority to then borrow that money and assess you that money. And so that's part of why it's a single authorization that was brought before you with 2 options available, was so as not to essentially put on the books a larger amount of authorization. And again, and part of the rationale for that is because it is a passive yes if you don't take action. We didn't want to put anyone in that bind where they had to formally say no or formally say yes to both. And if something were to happen, and we've experienced this where deadlines are not met because of COVID or whatever, and town meetings get shifted in ways that don't allow them to take action. We didn't want to put any particular town in that sort of circumstance. At the same time, I think that the best way I would suggest is that if you're supportive of the larger project would be to, this is my opinion, so take it for that. It's not necessarily school committee or otherwise, would be to vote to authorize the 1.5 million and then vote to or take action by the town of Amherst to cover those other amounts of money needed for that larger project, and to do everything you can to encourage your other member towns to carry their weight as well, and to help with the fundraising. I think that's the circumstance. The school committee still retains the sort of choice of what the actual project is and its implementation, and they will make that choice in January. And I don't think that the project and the need to sort of, as the superintendent said, the safety factor relative to that track is one that doesn't allow for delay. And so them making a decision in early January of next year allows us to get the process rolling and the construction process in the design, and then subsequently construction process moving as quickly as we can. So that it does put you in an odd spot because it's not a specific project. I fully understand and get that. I think that as the superintendent said, the indications from the discussions to school committees are very supportive of the larger project, and so it's really, I think, in voting to authorize, I think then if you want the larger project, then it's about each of the 4 communities working together to find a way to find that other funding and make that project happen. And I think the school committee is supportive of that larger project. So I think it's really, it puts us in an uncomfortable spot, but we're in a bit of a chicken and egg circumstance around this as far as trying to do fundraising with that, and needing some concrete steps by communities so that fundraisers can and donors can have some confidence in what they're donating toward. And at the same time, it puts each of the communities in a little bit of an awkward spot because they're authorizing a project. And what you're really authorizing is a replacement of track at a minimum. It's, sort of the minimum thing you're going to do is replace the track, which is desperately in need of being replaced. And, there is an option available for a larger project.
And I see two hands up. I'm gonna just take privilege for a second. So I tend to view it as a vote, pretty much as Doug described it, which is why I think I don't share the feeling that we need to know exactly which project it is to go forward, because the question for me is, at a minimum, do we want to have a credible track and field program for the Amherst regional schools? And if it's important to have a credible track and field program, which I think is, there are lots of reasons I can put forward for saying that it is, then it is worth going with the project. If it was only, yes, I'd like to see it be more. I hope it's more. I think that making that initial commitment increases the opportunity that it is more. But in the end, it's going to be voting on the assumption that in the lowest scenario, worst case scenario, it is just for the limited purpose, but I think it's an important limited purpose. But that's a decision that each counselor, we're all going to have to make for ourselves. Michelle, you're next.
Thank you. And I do want to acknowledge, as a new counselor and as a new member of the Finance Committee, this is a lot to digest. And so I really appreciate any efforts to give counselors more background or more time for discussion within the time frame that we have, and to keep us abreast to any additional conversations that may be or that may occur around this that would be helpful for us. I have two questions. The first is just a curiosity around how long was it known that this track was in need of repair or replacement? And was there any sort of reserves that were being set aside? And sort of generally as a practice, if we know that there's something that is deteriorating or will need replacement, how does that get handled? And then more specifically, I'm curious if we are, as a council, able to vote on an amended authorization to force a greater investment from the community, or is it sort of just a yes, no choice for us?
So I'll answer the second one first. It's a bit of a yes, no. The authorization comes from the regional school committee. They make the recommendation for a borrowing, and then each of the 4 towns has an opportunity to accept or reject that within that 60-day time frame. But you really can't alter that authorization. It is under the purview of the regional school committee. Regarding the general issues around the track, it's planning and project planning around this. We've had conversations. We've known the track was in a 4-stage repair for a while. It's gotten increasingly worse. The regional schools, in cooperation with the town of Amherst, did a recreation working group for the downtown area. So there's a number of fields throughout the downtown. We partnered with Weston and Sampson to do a bit of a master planning process relative to those fields, and partly because we knew that there was a fairly large capital ask in regard to this track and the other fields in and around the downtown area that are, it's going to be difficult to sort of realize the master plan. And we knew that a big first step would be the replacement of the track. So it's been known for a number of years. Pandemic didn't do anybody any favors relative to timing and getting started. But I think the difficulty we've run into also is it is such a large and multifaceted, from a funding standpoint, project because, once we sort of know the numbers of what it takes to do it, we also recognize we can't just assess that through our regional process. We need to have support from other things like donations and grants and gifts and other things. And so that makes it a lot more complex, which invariably makes things go a little bit slower. So that's slowed things down. But again, the difficulty we're facing is that the tracks continue to deteriorate. So time is not on our side, in as much as we've started looking at this in earnest in the last, 4 or 5 years. We've been looking at this in earnest and really being, in some ways, kind of perplexed at how difficult a task and what potential avenues we could explore to try to move this thing forward. So, we've kind of been pressed into forcing people, forcing decisions and people's hands in some respects by the nature of the project and the status that we're in. And so we've had to kind of, in a way, sort of forge ahead relative to some actionable steps that people can take, and hopefully we can still execute on that larger plan, which I think most people are in support of, just because they recognize the value it brings both to the regional school and to the center of Amherst.
Andy, is it okay if I add to that quickly?
Yes.
So as Doug mentioned, we've known about it for a while. When the track came up on the region capital plan, when it was just a track replacement, the decision was made at that time, mostly driven by the athletic director, to explore this larger project, because at that same time we were having lots of field condition issues. It was a year that there was a lot of droughts and the fields were, in really rough shape. So we formed the working group as Doug described, and we had a strategic plan put together. And at that time, the strategic plan gave a very wide range of costs. I think it said it could cost anywhere from $2 million to $6 million to do this project. So it was helpful, but not super helpful, because it wasn't a detailed dive into a specific project. We did set aside a little bit of money. Doug would have to go back and look and see what those contributions were. When the region had good years, we did put a little bit into stabilization funds specifically for this project. However, the region has not had many good years where we were able to do that, but there was at least one I recall. And then, so after we had the strategic plan, as Doug mentioned, we were able to go back, or I think Doug went and got CPA funds to start diving into this project further. And just in the past several months, we were able to get the more detailed cost estimate of what this project would be. I think sometime in, was it December or January, Doug? Maybe a little bit after that.
We engaged with them. They finished up in sort of mid-February.
Okay, that we got the more specific 4.7 price tag. So it's been a long time, a lot of planning, sort of thinking about what this could be. And then, as Doug mentioned, the pandemic didn't help in terms of moving everything forward.
Thank you. Bernie, let's see.
Yeah, I would. I'd feel, I think, more comfortable if I knew exactly what we were buying. And, so Doug's statement that we're basically voting for the minimum plan is helpful. I'm curious as to how much conversation has gone into these options in terms of the use of CPA money. Because option 4, which has the AstroTurf, the artificial turf in it, adds even more complications in terms of doing that and using CPA money. So you're basically at that point inviting a separate entity with some legal standing to purchase and install the artificial turf, then donate it to the region to get around the limitations on CPA money. So there's a question about how much that's been explored. I think I would be more comfortable with people saying, the school committee saying, we want this and we're going to have it done by this time, and this is how we're going to get there, rather than to roll out a series of what ifs.
Andy, is it okay if I speak to the first one about the CPA?
Yeah, I think I was going to ask you to do that.
Yeah, so we have spoken with the CPA coalition, and we've worked with our attorneys on this piece. You're right, it is more complicated because CPA funds can't be used for turf. So that's why the allocation for CPA is organized the way it is that it's more or less reflective of what the track portion of the project would be, which the track is eligible for CPA funds. And so to your point, we would have to have a separate accounting and keep good records of that the CPA funds are for a portion of the project and not the whole project. And in a similar fashion as the discussion that happened on the CPA recommendations recently, if the town was to invest a significant amount of CPA funds into the region, we would be looking for similar types of deed restrictions or restrictions similar when we purchase recreational land on the track portion of that project. So it would provide some assurance that it would remain a track into the future.
Okay, I just suggest that sometimes simple is the best way to go. You know, the track's been a need for quite some time. It's been obvious. We have lots of capital needs and we keep dancing around them. So I'm glad to see that people are really taking this on, but you know, a more explicit statement about this is the project and this is how we're going to accomplish it would be welcomed. Thanks.
Now, the council is going to have to deal with the question of what we're allowed to do with CPA funds, as will the CPA committee. I mean, both have to come to a similar conclusion to allow it to go forward. But for those who are unfamiliar, there is a provision in the Community Preservation Act that's passed by the legislature that was created at a time when there was particular concern about the safety of artificial turf fields, of saying that CPA money cannot be used for projects that are artificial turf fields. And that's what we're trying to address in this question. I think we have to decide both how we feel about as a region and as 4 different towns about having a artificial turf field, and then secondly, how we can engineer the use of CPA funds to advance the project and be consistent with the statute. Sean, do you have anything to add to that? Then let's just see what Bob has to say, and then I'm going to have to draw this to a close.
Yeah, the one other thing I'll add quickly, just so everyone is aware of what else would have to happen. In order for us to borrow from CPA, we would have to form some sort of intermunicipal agreement with the region. We've spoken, the region and the town have the same bond counsel. That's the legal counsel that helps structure debt authorizations and things like that. And we've had a preliminary conversation with bond counsel of how, if this did go forward, how it would work. And so our bond counsel has drafted these types of agreements for other communities that are part of regional schools, between communities and regional school systems. But just so people are aware, it would require some sort of special agreement between the town and the regional school district.
But that's not unusual, because we did that just for the construction project to add to and renovate the high school. So this is really different.
Or the one back in the that might have been before I started at the school, so it'd be a while ago.
Yeah, but there is precedent. That's all. Yep. The point. Bob, did you have anything that you wanted to add and questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask or pose a couple of questions. The first is that I'm a little bit concerned about the potential for getting into a budget problem if we have severe inflation or more inflation in the materials costs, and whether that's built into the budget or not. And then the second question I have, and maybe I've missed this, or maybe I just haven't seen all the documentation, but how long would the track and the fields last under the various options, and what are the annual maintenance costs for each of those? Because I think we need to be looking at this from a broad perspective of not only how much do we have to borrow or somehow raise to get it in the first place, but what are the ongoing costs that are already going to be added to an already tight regional school budget?
So I can take into consideration that. So in the projected estimates, there is some inflationary components factored in. You know, whether or not the recent trend in the last few months is really fully articulated there is not likely. But nonetheless, the sort of material and labor cost increases in a project like this over time have been factored in. Some overages for cost overruns are part of the projection of the 4.7. So. And the 1.5, those are definitely in there. Obviously, if we stay at 6, 7, 8% inflation, it's going to be a decidedly tougher project to get to, and longer wait, more expensive it gets too. So it's kind of a rock and a hard place circumstance in some respects that way relative to those costs. On the second point, a few of those things have been kind of teased out in some of the materials that came with the original master planning document, but also in the more recent Weston and Sampson work that we had to do to refine the numbers. The short story is that when you look at sort of the field itself, the sort of interior field maintenance, when you consider the cost of installation, the year-over-year maintenance, because both natural surfaces and artificial surfaces have year-over-year maintenance. And the difference in playing time, you tend to get they're very comparable natural surface versus an artificial surface as far as cost per year per square foot, that type of thing. However, what you get really that I think is the huge advantage with an artificial surface is about 2.5 to 3 times the playing time, and you have a lot easier time scheduling because you don't have to wait for fields to dry out, that sort of thing. So I think that larger project is fairly cost effective. I think the other thing that factors in that's a little more subtle is by moving the location, the efficiency with which we're using the fields goes up. So the number of playing fields and the amount of time and spaces we have are more efficiently used and sort of more effectively used than what we currently have as far as how we're structured. So there's a lot of pluses to the larger rotation of the track and that. As part and parcel of a project versus keeping it in place. The track itself, the surface of the track, roughly about 20 years. The surface, if you go with a grass field, it's every year maintenance, and depending on how much you use it, we tend to overuse our fields as they currently exist, and so we're always playing catch up, trying to get them to a reasonable playing standard. But an artificial surface, about a 10-year window is considered a typical lifespan for those before you need to replace them. Although once you have one in place, the replacement cost is less. It's still expensive when you go to replace an artificial surface, but the infrastructure that goes underneath it is more durable and lasts longer than you go just replacing sort of the surface materials when you do a replacement at that sort of 10-year point. Some of them last longer, up to 15, but I think the reasonable estimate for life span on an artificial surface is about 10 years.
So then, if I understand correctly, and Andy, I'm sorry to prolong this, but we'd still be paying off the debt on the artificial field when we have to incur more debt or more cost to replace it. Is that correct?
No, not really, because you can't borrow for longer than the life of the thing you borrow for. So if you looked at the slide deck, you'll notice that the payments in the first 10 years are decidedly higher than like almost triple the ones in the last 10 years. And part of that's because the borrowing for the artificial surface would be prorated over a 10-year period, whereas the track would be prorated over a 20-year period. So we have to borrow for lengths of time that match the life of whatever it is we're buying.
Okay, but again, the project is going to be more expensive in the long run than what we're actually putting out now, because we're going to have to replace the artificial. If we chose to go to the artificial field turf, we'd have to replace that in 10 or 15 years versus just having a field of grass that needs to be maintained.
Right, and as I say, the sort of year-over-year costs and for maintenance on and usability of a grass surface, are the cost per year are comparable. Between an artificial surface and a natural surface, the amount of rest that's needed, the amount of seating, reseating, et cetera, those labor costs are decidedly higher on a year-over-year basis. So in totality, you run into a similar overall price structure over time. You just take it in big hits at the beginning of each cycle, and then your year-over-year costs for an artificial surface yearly maintenance is much lower, but then you have a big spike when you do a replacement. So it's sort of differences in when you pay, but you end up paying about the same.
Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna, since Pam's been here all and hasn't asked any questions, let's see if you have anything that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I was gonna, sorry, I was gonna ask about the changeover or the improvements to the field. So if the track gets reoriented, whether it gets a turf field or not, let's just say it gets reoriented. Where do we see in the budget the cost for upgrading the entire remaining field area? In other words, the rest of the grass areas. It occurred to me that in the conversation about the elementary schools, that there were costs associated with bringing up playing fields as part of the cost, or not part of the cost, but there is a cost to improving the grass fields as well. And where in our outgoing budgets do we see those costs accounted for? Thanks.
So I think that there is some in the process of sort of moving the track, and there'll be some earthwork that'll need to be done where the track currently exists. The idea would be is in the future that potentially could be the location of a softball field oriented properly to the sun. But that would be a separate capital project if it needed. I mean, there'll be some basic amount of work done there, so it is a playable space. Will it be fully a softball facility? No, will not. That would be a separate capital ask at a future time, and I think that's to be determined. I think as far as the year-over-year maintenance of those grass spaces for use, which they would be for practices, games, et cetera, it's still a usable and playable space and will be used for that. And so those will be built in our operating budgets to cover those costs of water, seed, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. We do need to move it along and conclude the meeting in just one. So I'm going to do that. But Sean, did you have anything else that you?
I just wanted to say a couple of really quick points. One, this project does include quite a substantial accessibility improvement to get students in wheelchairs with other accessibility issues down to the field that doesn't currently exist. So I just want to point that out. And then to Bob's questions about maintenance, I think that's something that we've talked a lot about. And there's two pieces to that. One is if there's fundraising, I think our goal or a goal should be that there's fundraising for maintenance and that would be put aside into a fund for ongoing maintenance of the turf. The other piece that would be unique is that a turf facility can actually generate revenue through rental throughout the year, and what we're told is it can generate quite a bit of revenue. And I think another expectation that Amherst should set is that revenue is put aside into a maintenance fund as well, so that when it does come time to replace the turf, a sizable portion of that can be paid out of that maintenance fund. The region already has a revolving fund set up for that type of purpose, so it would really be just making sure that expectation is set.
Jennifer?
I would just, that was a really important point that Sean just made. If, we could get that more upfront and center, maybe in future conversations, that surface could be revenue generating. That I just want to throw that in.
Okay, well, thank you. So what I was, to draw this to a conclusion, we agreed that we would encourage additional questions to be submitted in writing, that we will try and organize them and get them to Doug and Mike for their consideration. What I'd like to propose is a schedule, and I will send an email out to the council tomorrow probably will not get it done this afternoon because of another event that I need to get to. But if people can get the questions to us by Friday, that'd be helpful. But that I had set a hard deadline of the 19th, the day after Patriots Day, a week from today. And that's the day that I'll try and bundle the questions in an organized fashion. And then probably if Sean is available to help, use his help to get them to Doug and Mike. And we will then have, as noted previously, the public hearing, which will not be discussion. It's a public hearing for that purpose, but I'm hoping we can limit that because the council discussion will be later, though I think that's ultimately up to Lynn to help organize as to how she wants to organize the time for the council meeting, of which this is a part on the 25th. 26th, there's going to be the final meeting of the Finance Committee in which we'll come back with the questions, and Doug will be with us for the first part of that meeting to for focusing on the questions that are proposed through this process. And then the Finance Committee will need to meet to make a recommendation on both capital and on the operating budgets for the regional schools, and get so that it can get in a report in time for council consideration and discussion on May 2nd. So that's the process we're going forward with. If there are no questions about that, then the last items, there's been nobody, no attendees that I'm in the audience, so we don't need to do public comment. I just need a couple minutes on the process for the May meetings. Anybody's interested in that, we should do that, but we want to make that really quick. But I do want to talk about how the process works in the schedule, so that's forbearance of the committee on that. Lynn,
I'd like to go ahead and adjourn the full council meeting since the rest of this really only pertains to the Finance Committee. Okay.
Okay.
You're welcome to stay, but I just want to make sure you can go because it's been a long morning. Okay.
I'd like to say thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time, and I'll happy to answer questions you have. So we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Doug.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Again,
Thank you, Doug.
really appreciate it.
Andy, I have to leave, and I don't want to miss the process piece, so I can follow up with you, later if that's needed, or if that can happen at the next meeting.
Let me just tell you real quickly, maybe Lynn this will only take just a second to do this, the very first part of it, and then if you duck out, I understand. Lynn, could you put up that thing that I sent to this morning, just real quick? And what it is a process that's really similar to what we've used in prior years, and it involves participation of committee members. And so at the next meeting, we will need to make some final decisions. I'll try and work something out, but we try and get have each of the members of the Finance Committee, the 8 of us, take on some responsibility separate for each of the items and how we would go forward. So if you look at what we do, we have various committee members who are assigned to review each department and solicit questions ahead of time. And that doesn't mean that questions shouldn't be thought about from all members of the committee, but it's helpful to have one member of the committee who does take primary responsibility to focus on a particular issue. We're going to have a very tight schedule, which Lynn can also put on the screen, but you may have seen it already. But what we were thinking of is that we're going to ask the departments to limit their overview to 5 to 10 minutes, and then that will allow us to then get questions and discussion from other members of the committee. And what the additional item, if you have it available, is just the grid, that which shows where each department is. You just had it on the screen for a second, Lynn. Those we'll make sure that those get back out to you so that you can focus on what it is. But I will be looking for people to express interest about if they have a particular department that, or second group of departments that they're interested in, because we'll also look to the people who've taken on that responsibility to help with drafting the report after the meeting is done, and then we start moving towards what we're going to report back to the council on each of these areas. So any comments or questions about process? Seeing no questions, we have no public comment required today because there's no members of the public who are present, which then gets us back to the, has anybody had a chance to look at the minutes of March 29th that were in the packet? Any suggestions for amendments, changes to the minutes? Does anybody want to make a motion to it? Lynn?
Yeah, I move that we accept the minutes for March
29th
29th, 2022.
as presented, since nobody has proposed any amendments. As their second? I will second it so we can move this along. Let's just take a quick vote and then I think we can adjourn. Lynn?
Yay.
And Bob, you're okay with the minutes?
I'm fine with them.
Yep. Matt? Bernie? Either of you have any questions?
I concur.
Okay, Michelle, I think you had to leave. Kathy?
Yes.
I'm a yes.
Andy, I just have one comment. I'm a reluctant yes, because I actually didn't read them. So what I'm hoping in the future when we do this, would you tell us that you've read them and made any minor changes in them? You know, in the past, I always did a review and almost never had any more than a minor edit, but I feel a little, since there are only 3 of us, I didn't want to abstain because you wouldn't have had a majority vote on the minutes, but it's just a request for the future. Okay.
No, I did look at the minutes and I think they were fine. I think these were written by Athena. And I think that, you know, she is always very straightforward and makes sure that all legal aspects that are required in minutes are taken care of.
Yeah, my only point is I would like to have know that one person has read them besides the minute taker. So that's it. Just if you could make that statement for the next time.
Yeah,
I'm just.
no, I just,
okay.
if you asked the question, I wouldn't say that. So I don't think that we have anything else. We know when the next meeting is, we know what the process is going forward. I will send something out. So thank you very much. And Appreciate
everyone.
everybody's forbearance with what was a very long but productive meeting.
Bye.
Bye.